Welcome back, AP Gov students. Today is Unit 4 review. This will be a collection of all the key terms and notes from each chapter of Keeping the Republic that corresponds to Unit 4. As always, if you don't have Keeping the Republic, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I encourage you to follow along and take notes as well. Partisanship, conflict between parties. This is one of the main things that plagues government effectiveness and also the cohesiveness of society. So within specifically the houses of Congress, but also just altogether just in the political sphere as a whole, partisanship, the difference between Democrats and Republicans, really holds back the effectiveness of government and how much stuff can actually get done because of the constant fighting. And also, I think the underrated thing is not really partisanship, but the infighting within the parties is also really important. I think that's at a heightened point right now too. Party and government, people from a political party holding public office. These people emerge as the most popular people from a given party and are in charge of actually getting the party agenda implemented. So the people from each party that win their elections, they become the party members in government, and they have a heightened responsibility now to push their party's agenda. Party base, staunch supporters. These people are relied upon as being consistent supporters and possible donors to the party. The party base plays a large role in primaries when people have to actually choose their candidate. The candidates running in the party primaries want to appeal to the base to get their support, and then they can worry about crossing the aisle later once they win the primary. Party platforms, the positions that the party takes on various issues. Members of the political party are expected to fall in line with the platform, and members in government try to push the agenda. Before an election cycle, political parties will put out their party agenda, and it just defines what the issues for the party are, the top issues, and what their views on each one of the issues. Party activists, members who do the most for their party. These people are often the most extreme members and tend to not accurately reflect the attitudes of most of the party. These are the ones doing on-the-ground work for the party, the ones out at marches, the ones doing rallies. This is one of the reasons why the media likes to capitalize on opposing party rallies, is because you'll often find the craziest supporters at the rallies and at the marches to interview and get sound bites and things like that. Party machines, systems in place that influence voters at smaller levels. There is structured on-the-ground work at the local level done by parties to influence voters. These are the people who are active in the community, pushing their party onto people, not like in a malicious way, but just in a way to get people involved with the party and get people involved in politics. Party primaries, elections within primaries to decide candidates. These elections give party members influence over who from the party will run for office. This is a big thing with obviously just the presidential elections. Party members want to select their best candidate to run on the national stage in order to give themselves the best chance to win. Critical elections, elections that start new party eras. These elections signal the shift of populations from one party to another, or even the creation of new dominant parties. Certain elections that are supposed to be critical or not are often contested. The ones that are a lot older become the more obvious critical elections. There are some debate now whether the 2016 election was critical, the 2020 election, the upcoming 2024 election, will it be the critical election or not? It's hard to say, but these elections become landmarks in American history. I think critical elections are a big thing, like APUSH, recognizing where certain eras start with certain presidencies. Electioneering, recruiting candidates and nominating them for election, is a long process that rigorously analyzes potential candidates in order for parties to be confident that they have the best chance to win. Parties want to select the best candidates because they want to have the best chance to win elections. There's actually an interesting thing with the Republican Party. The reason why they have lost so many primaries recently when a lot of the polls were showing that they were going to win is because they hadn't been doing the best electioneering. They were picking bad candidates to run, and that's why they were losing elections that everyone thought they would win. Closed primaries, primaries open to just party members. These primaries get results for who people in the party want, but do not get potential valuable information from independents. So the closed primaries are pretty good in targeting what the base of the party wants, who their candidate should be, but it doesn't really get the best information for who would be the best candidate on the national stage because you don't get the independents or cross-party people from voting. Open primaries, primaries open to anyone. They gather information from potential independent or cross-party voters, but can possibly be sabotaged from people who will ultimately not vote for the candidate. This is a big problem in the recent primaries. There are many things about how Democratic voters were going into the primaries and voting for Nikki Haley, kind of inflating her numbers. I don't really think there's too much merit in that, but it is a thing that can happen. Nominating convention, where delegates pick the party candidate. This is often a big unifying event for a party where the leading candidate and platform is set in motion. So you have the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention, and delegates will vote based on the primary results who the candidate will be. These are pretty much always made into just big political spectacles for the party. They'll have speeches and famous people who support the party to give speeches and rallies and things like that. Soft money, funds from donors and contributors. This money can be used in almost any way the party sees fit. However, government regulations play a role. So the money can't be used for everything or just can't come from anywhere, but there is a problem with soft money that it's not regulated enough. Party discipline, remaining loyal to one's party. Historically, and especially now, American politics has lacked discipline. A lot of party members will go rogue. That was one of the problems with Trump in the 2016 election, is that he wasn't a traditional Republican, and he kind of differentiated from a lot of the other Republican candidates and the Republican platform. The Trump reign has always been kind of a thing where the Republican Party doesn't really have a platform, it's just the Trump platform. Redistributive policies, they shift resources from rich to poor. They are almost always monetary policies. They are very progressive and controversial. When you hear terms like redistributing wealth or wealth redistribution, whatever order, they're talking about redistributive policies. And it's not literally taking money from people that are richer and giving them to people that are poor. That's not how they work. But examples of redistributive policies would be things like welfare, food stamps, or something like that. Basically, programs that get their funding by taxing people in higher tax brackets, and that money that is gained from those taxes are given to people who need things like welfare and food stamps, who are people that are poor. Distributive policies paid for by taxpayers and benefit everyone. So the benefits from these policies don't just go to people that are poor, they go to everyone, so it's different from redistributive policies. The burden is placed on everyone in order to fund programs that benefit the public. An example of these would be programs that spend money on like infrastructure, because that money is gained from tax money, but it benefits everyone because everyone uses roads and highways and things like that. It's not just for people that are poor. So they are distributive policies because the benefits go to everybody. Regulatory policies restrict the behavior of certain groups. They are most commonly used to control business practices. They can be controversial because many are viewed as unnecessary and people generally don't want to listen to the government. These are done by big bureaucratic organizations. There are a lot of different three-letter agencies, they might be called, that are meant to regulate businesses. But the reason they are controversial is because most businesses believe that their practices are the best, and they don't want to necessarily listen to the government, and they don't want to do what the government wants them to do. When you hear things from politicians talking about deregulation, this is in reference to business regulatory policies, because some politicians believe that if you take away some of the unnecessary regulations, that businesses would be more free, and that would make business practice better, not worse. There's a lot of arguments for whether a lot of business regulation is good or bad, and it has to do with consumer versus business debate. Triggering event that rallies interest in a certain policy. These events play an important role in getting policies implemented, as policies need momentum and interest to get passed. I think a good example of this would be like 9/11 with the USA Patriot Act. The sheer scope of intelligence and like spying that can now be done because of the USA Patriot Act probably never would have passed unless there was a massive threat to national security like 9/11. If that never happened, I don't think people would have seen the importance of passing something like the USA Patriot Act, and it might have been seen as a massive government overreach. But when you have the threat of a terrorist attack or another terrorist attack after 9/11, a lot of people got on board with the USA Patriot Act that I doubt would have without a big triggering event like 9/11. Social policies aim to improve the lives of citizens. These policies help the general public. The main goal of these policies is to aid on the economic side. Pretty much everything can be framed as a social policy, but what this is really referencing is like the programs, the public programs that are done to help aid people, specifically poor people. That's why a lot of social policy is social spending policy. Social welfare policies provide for poor people. Again, social policy is like a really broad scope. Social welfare policy is like pretty much all of social policy. They provide for poor people. These policies give money to people in order for them to afford basic necessities. It is a societal safety net. These are things, again, like welfare, food stamps, things like that. Medicaid, even. Social insurance programs offer benefits after contributions are made. They require people to pay into programs in order to be able to collect at a later time. The biggest example of this is Social Security. You have to pay in when you're working. It takes Social Security, a percentage out of your paycheck, to pay into Social Security. And then when you retire and you need money, you start to collect Social Security at like 65, or you can collect earlier at like 62, I believe. The big problem with social insurance programs is that if you don't have enough people paying into the program, you can't fund people that are trying to collect and take out of it. And that's the huge problem with Social Security right now, is that there's a really large percentage of retired people and not enough money is getting paid in by working people. and the Social Security system is supposed to run out very soon. I forget the exact year. But when they are working, it's almost like infinite money. You get the people that are working to pay into programs, and you give it out to people that need it. Social Security savings program that gives money to retired people after paying in while working. It is critical for a lot of retired people to be able to collect Social Security checks. However, the program is going broke and will fail, and most attempts to fix it don't come to fruition. So I already kind of touched on this, but the reason why most attempts to fix it don't work in government is because people are promised their Social Security. Everyone who pays into it wants to collect when they're retired. No one wants to eliminate Social Security before they get their chance to collect. So it's almost never going to get changed unless somebody just steps up and changes it. However, you can't just do it like one person. You have to get a lot of the government to step up to vote to change Social Security. However, all of the constituents are just people who need to collect Social Security eventually and want to, and were promised that they would get their money back after they paid into it. So essentially, people realize that Social Security needs to be changed, but everyone wants their money first, but everyone gets money. It's like infinite. Everyone who pays in eventually takes it out. So no one's ever going to want to change it. I know I'm kind of just spitting, but you should definitely watch like a YouTube video about social insurance policies and Social Security, because it's really interesting how Social Security is going to fail, but how the politics of it gets in the way, and how, no one can really fix it even though it needs to be fixed. Entitlement program, people who qualify must get benefits. These programs ensure that all people who need something will get it. Unfortunately, entitlement rights come in conflict with government attempts to change certain programs. Again, this is the problem with Social Security, is that people are promised money after they pay in when they're working, so no one wants to change it before they get their entitlements. But since everyone kind of alive and who pays taxes is entitled to Social Security, no one ever wants to change it. Temporary assistance to needy families, TANF, state-run welfare programs. States are given control over administering welfare. Many states have guidelines that make people work or show attempts at getting a job in order to collect. I actually had a whole debate in my Gov class about whether work requirements and showing attempts to try and find a job is necessary to get welfare, or if welfare should just be unconditional. One of the problems with the welfare system is oftentimes people who work minimum wage jobs or work lesser jobs actually get a lot less out of it than if they just stay unemployed and collect welfare. And there are a lot of backwards incentives when it comes to the welfare system, so welfare almost becomes better than starting your journey to get back into the working life. However, for people who really need welfare, TANF is the best safety net that the government has to prevent people from, abject poverty. Supplemental nutrition assistance, SNAP, these are just food stamps. Many people rely on food stamps to survive. This program has problems with being only beneficial to someone's food budget and not anything else. So yeah, one of the problems with food stamps is that it provides a lot of money and a big budget to spend on food, but for people who don't eat a lot and want to save money, they can't use their food stamp funds to buy other things. So a lot of people just end up with wasted food stamps, or they just buy things they don't need. One of the proposals to reform the welfare and food stamp system is to make a whole new system that just gives money and allows people to make more decisions on their budget, rather than giving separate welfare for food and then another welfare check in TANF. And there's actually a whole black market for food stamps, where people will turn in their food stamps to people who need them in order to get money. So people will trade $10 of food stamps for a $5 bill. I watched a really interesting documentary in my Gov class about the problems and kind of the underground problems with food stamps and with welfare. Medicare, health coverage for elderly and disabled people. All elderly people receive Medicare coverage. It covers hospital stays as well as other random health fees. I'm almost positive it's 65 or it's 62 when you can go on Medicare. And this basically just covers all elderly people. The government funds healthcare for elders. Don't get this confused with Medicaid. Medicare and Medicaid are often really confused terms. I used to get them confused all the time. Medicaid is like welfare healthcare, so it provides for poor people. You don't have to be old to have Medicaid. And then Medicare is for all old people. Here's Medicaid, health coverage for the poor. This is done mostly at the state level. It was later expanded by Obamacare to give more people private health coverage. There are a lot of problems with the Medicaid and Obamacare system. It's really over my head. When I had to research this, I was getting really confused. I don't really get a lot of the insurance policy, and I don't expect any of you to get it. You don't really need to understand the whole scope of Obamacare to do anything in Gov. But if you're interested in it, I would recommend doing some further research. The main point with Obamacare is that it expanded healthcare, Medicaid greatly for people. However, there are some problems with how much it costs and deductibles and things like that. Subsidies, financial rewards for certain behaviors. The government gives money to businesses, institutions, and individuals to encourage behaviors that will ultimately benefit society. So on like the individual level, if you do things like volunteering in your community, you will get tax breaks. For businesses, if they pursue maybe greater environmental practices, or if they donate to charities, they'll get tax breaks. And institutions like colleges and universities, if they expand, their university research or something like that, they can even get tax breaks. So if you listen to all my examples, subsidies mainly come in the form of just tax breaks, but there are all sorts of financial incentives to individuals, institutions, and businesses. If they do certain things that benefit, mostly in the form of charity, protecting the environment, things like that, the government wants to incentivize those behaviors, so they give out money. Environmental policy aims to reduce pollution and protect the environment. This falls in conjunction with regulatory policy. It is a relatively new movement by the government, as people and businesses do not do enough to preserve the environment. I think the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was only created in like the 60s or 70s. The reason why environmental policy is closely related with regulatory policy is that most of environmental policy is just making sure businesses protect the environment, specifically like oil businesses or construction companies or like lumber companies, things like that. Because the main threat to the environment is businesses who are self-interested and want to collect their resources in the most efficient way possible, and oftentimes that comes in conflict with the environment. So environmental regulatory policy is done to make sure businesses aren't harming the environment. However, the broader scope of environmental policy is a lot of it's done by local and state governments to make sure they're complying with like water stuff and making sure they're not polluting the ground. Clean Air Act sets air quality standards through the EPA. It is one of the many guidelines pushed by the Environmental Protection Agency. Again, this was only created in, I believe, 1970. However, the EPA is incredibly influential, especially now with everyone being aware of climate change and things like that. Gross domestic product, this is just GDP, value of all goods produced in 1 year. It is the most significant and notable measurement to determine the success of a country's economy. Although GDP is the most common statistic, it's technically not the best statistic for measuring a country's economy. There are a few like totally nerded out numbers and statistics and formulas that are better than GDP to measure an economy, but those are way over the head of me and all of you and everyone else in high school. But essentially what GDP measures is just how much is being produced at all levels of the economy, the local stores, the big national companies, and it takes all that up and adds it up, and it shows how active a country's or region's economy is. And a high GDP usually shows that there is a healthy economy and that businesses are producing at an efficient rate. Overheated economy, expansion of growth that outweighs supply. This happens when there is too much economic expansion in too little time, so the demand for products outgrows what is being produced. So if there's a massive boom in the economy, consumers have a ton of money in their pockets, they want a lot of new goods, it could outweigh what is being sold, and this could lead to shortages because companies don't have enough time to produce the amount of goods that the consumers want. It all comes down to the supply and demand graph. Inflation, when prices rise to match supply and demand. This hurts the economy because the prices of all goods have to increase in order to prevent shortages. So if there's a ton of money in the consumer's hands, the demand goes way up, but when the demand goes way up, the supply has to come up, but if it can't rise enough to meet the demand, the only thing for businesses to do is raise prices a ton to limit the amount of people buying products. This is why one of the main causes of inflation is government spending, because the more checks you give to people, the more like welfare you give out and tax breaks, things like that, it puts more money in the consumer's hands, and businesses have to raise prices in order to prevent shortages. This is why a lot of the COVID policy advanced inflation in the country, because they were trying to keep the economy stimulated by putting money in the people's hands, but too much government spending was done in that time. That's why inflation rose a ton. Recession, economic slowdown. This occurs when there is a considerable decline in GDP. A good example of this would be the 2008 recession, when the housing market collapsed, the stock market collapsed, businesses weren't producing as much, the GDP dropped a ton. Depression, more prolonged and consequential recession. Everyone knows what the Great Depression was. It is an extreme economic collapse that reaches levels only observed once in American history, again, the Great Depression. This is worse than a recession because the government or businesses can't do enough to rise out of it. It becomes a prolonged economic downturn, and there's a lot of economic suffering. Unemployment rate, the percentage of the labor force that is not working but is trying to work. It is a good statistic to look at when analyzing the health of an economy. If the unemployment rate is high, businesses are not doing well, and neither are the people. Because if the unemployment rate is high and no one can find a job, that usually means that businesses are not hiring, and when businesses are not hiring, that means they're not expanding or they're not making enough money to hire more employees. So if there's a high unemployment rate, the health of businesses in the country or area are not good. And that's why unemployment rate in combination with GDP are great statistics to look at when analyzing the health of a region. Fiscal policy, the government's power to tax and spend money. All government intervention in the economy falls under fiscal policy. The government has immense resources to affect the economy with spending bills. Although fiscal policy sounds like kind of like a weird term, it is a massive umbrella term for basically everything the government does. All government spending falls under fiscal policy. Every program that the government institutes, every tax break, tax cut, all that type of stuff is just fiscal policy because they're manipulating where money is going, how much money is going to certain places. All of that is fiscal policy. Keynesianism, I think that's how you pronounce it. The government can help the economy by how much it spends. This theory states that the government should pump money into the economy in times of downturn and withhold money in times of success. So essentially what this theory states is that when the economy is in a massive downturn, it's in a massive dry spell, if you pump money into the consumer side of the economy, consumers will start spending more money, and that will help businesses because they're buying more products, and that will raise out of the downturn. And then when the economy is doing well, you can withhold money. You don't have to give money to people when the economy is doing well because the economy can just ride it out. And this will prevent inflation if you don't continue to give money to people because they'll just use what they have and it won't rise inflation, things like that. And essentially, if you even out the times of downturn and the times of success, all the government spending and not spending will balance out and you'll end up with a balanced budget. However, this basically never happens. What really happens under Keynesianism is that the government just ends up spending a ton of money, but that's kind of just where we are as a country with the budget and the debt being massive. Monetary policy, controlling the economy through the money supply and interest rates. Manipulating interest rates controls how much money people have, which can either encourage or discourage spending and investment. So what this is the Fed, the Federal Reserve, controlling banks and their interest rates. If you raise the interest rates a ton on loans, less people will be taking out larger loans, and that stops more money from going to people, and that will curb inflation. But when the economy is in a massive downturn, you might drop the interest rates a lot, and that will encourage people to take out more loans and spend more money. Federal Reserve System, this is the Fed, commission that controls the money supply. The Fed is in charge of setting the interest rates, which is followed by banks, ultimately controlling how much money the people and banks have. I'm honestly still a little confused about how the Fed's interest rates affect and the banks always follow what the Fed is doing. However, what you essentially have to know is that somehow, some way, by certain influences, the banks listen to the Fed when the Fed sets their interest rates. I think it's partly to do because the banks borrow money from the Fed and all that stuff, so their interest rates have to follow what they're borrowing and stuff like that. But anyways, the Fed, when they set their interest rates, banks follow them, and that's how interest rates are manipulated. Supply side economics incentivizes greater investment through tax cuts. Supply side economics are typically, the goal of this theory is to increase business investment, which will lead to greater production and result in more products at lower prices for the people. This is typically tied to more conservative economic policy. What this will do is either give money to businesses or lower regulation and cut taxes for businesses. The theory is that the businesses will use this extra money to increase investment and increase production and make production more efficient, and at the end of the day, this will drop prices, and that will benefit the people as a whole. However, there are problems with this theory because what businesses will do with the extra money is not always put it to greater production and helping to lower prices. They'll just end up investing it or using it for themselves in a way that doesn't have anything to do with production. Progressive tax system, taxes increase as income increases. America has a very progressive tax system. Money is separated into income brackets that are taxed at increasingly higher rates. There are a lot of misconceptions, I think, about the American tax system. We have a extremely progressive tax system. It's even more progressive. It's more progressive than even the most liberal countries in Europe. The top level tax bracket is extremely highly taxed. But essentially what a progressive tax system is that money is separated by brackets at certain cutoffs. So for example, this is not even close to what the actual brackets are, but like 0 to 10 grand is taxed like 0%, 10 to 20 grand is taxed 5%, 20 to 30 grand is taxed 10%. So the more money you make, the greater it is taxed. And what this helps to do is put less of a tax burden on people making less money and put more of a tax burden on the rich people making a lot of money. Deregulation, reducing regulations on businesses. Many people believe that engaging in deregulation will allow businesses to produce more products and therefore lower prices. This is tied to supply-side economics. A lot of people believe that a lot of the bureaucratic regulations on businesses is just like useless red tape, and this ends up hurting businesses and consumers rather than protecting consumers. So if you start to deregulate the business world, people think that it will take a lot of the inefficiency out of production, and this will end up helping businesses produce more products at lower prices, and that will lower prices for consumers. Antitrust policy, mitigating the monopolization of industries. This was a huge thing in the early 20th century with like Teddy Roosevelt. The government has instituted many efforts to break up monopolies to create a fairer economy. So essentially what this is breaking up conglomerate businesses that control a massive percentage of a certain industry. A great example of this would be like Rockefeller with Standard Oil. He basically controlled the entire oil industry, which allowed him to set prices however he wanted to because he didn't have any competition. So the government has passed laws on breaking up monopolies. Protectionism, favoring domestic business by limiting foreign imports. Proponents of this agenda state that homeland businesses should be protected by instituting greater tariffs and regulations on foreign businesses. So if you raise taxes and duties on foreign goods, foreign companies will have to raise their prices on their goods in order to reach their profit margins. So what this will do is always make foreign products cost more than domestic products, and these type of policies are introduced in order to, support American businesses. Free trade policies, putting less regulation on foreign trade. This is rooted in truer free market principles. It allows the market to decide on the prices of domestic versus foreign goods. Proponents of this policy believe that the best way to protect consumers is to allow foreign goods and domestic goods to compete fairly in the market, and consumers will pick which one is better. A lot of people don't like the idea of artificially raising prices on foreign goods just to protect American businesses. They should challenge American businesses to make better products than the foreign businesses. Trade deficit, difference between the value of imports and exports. This has been going in a negative direction in America as the actual production of goods is mostly done overseas in almost every industry. One of the things with America, one of the trends with America is that we don't actually produce a lot of anything in our country anymore. Because we have such an advanced economy, a lot of what we do is in the service industry and the research and like behind the scenes stuff like that. We don't do a lot of on the ground like producing little goods like clothes and toys, things like that. A lot of that is done overseas in the less advanced economies. So in order to get our actual physical products, we have to import a ton of things from other countries, and we don't actually export a lot of hard goods anymore. North American Free Trade Agreement, this is NAFTA, removed a lot of trade barriers. This is a victory for free trade policy. However, there are valid arguments about the impact that this has on the job market. What this did was open up trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and ultimately this lowered prices from goods traded between those regions. However, this started to greatly affect the job market, specifically between Mexico and the United States. For example, this would have a huge impact on farming, because obviously Mexico would have a lot better farming weather than America has. We can only really do farming in the southeastern regions. So a lot of those jobs down in the southeast region moved down to Mexico, and this hurt the American job market. Nuclear triad, nuclear weapons from ground, sea, or air. This is where the chapter kind of starts to pivot to foreign policy. The threat of nuclear weaponry is the most powerful and influential foreign policy. So as much as you can do on like the diplomatic scene and things like economic relations and foreign relations, things like that, nuclear weapons are ultimately the best negotiating, resource that any country could have. If you have the facilities to eliminate any country that you want, it becomes the best bargaining leverage like you can possibly have. Terrorism, mass violence on innocent people. The threat of terrorism is a major driver of American foreign policy decisions. Basically, since 9/11, all foreign policy has been is counterterrorism. We have massive interest in like the Middle Eastern regions and Russia, things like that, when it comes to counteracting terrorism. A lot of American policy is balancing the relations in those like Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian regions, because we rely on those regions for a lot of goods, and specifically like oil, although a lot of those countries in that region have proxy states and like terrorism, organizations that are living in those countries. How do we balance our interests between preventing terrorism but also how much we rely on these countries and regions for goods? Anti-terrorism, defending citizens against foreign policy threats. A lot of on-the-ground police and military work is done to protect people. A massive part of our intelligence community and police and military budget is done to prevent terrorism. Counterterrorism deters terrorists from using force. The government and military is very active abroad in containing terrorist threats in rogue states. Most of our military operations, specifically done like in the Middle East, is counterterrorism based. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this is NATO, everyone should know what that is. Body consisting of most of Europe and the United States. It united the developed Western world in the post-Cold War landscape. It influences foreign policy around the world. This is just a massive conglomerate of all Western developed countries. The United States is the biggest player in this organization, even though we aren't like in Europe. This body controls all the foreign policy done within Europe and between European nations and other regions, specifically Russia and like the Middle East. And naturally, with dealing with so many regions like this has a huge connection to economic policy and things like trade agreements. Cybersecurity, security measures on the internet. This is a relatively new sphere for the government to be involved in. It is becoming more important as the internet expands. As more people use the internet and as the internet becomes a greater player in like all aspects of life, the government has a huge interest to make sure the cyberspace is secure and make sure that they're limiting crime and hacks and things like that. Especially now, as a lot of our government functions and a lot of business functions are done like based on the internet, they rely on the internet and AI. You have to make sure that those things are secure to prevent the country from basically being shut down just because of a hack. National debt, the money the government borrows. The government's debt is constantly increasing with no solution in sight. The debt conversation greatly influences fiscal politics, especially around budget setting. The budget seems to be a perennial talking point in American politics, especially because it's getting to the point where it's so bad. Every president recently has increased the budget. There isn't really a good solution for limiting the national debt other than slowly reducing spending. However, reducing spending seems to always be political suicide since no one wants their programs cut. Intergovernmental organizations, groups consisting of multiple countries. Notable institutions like NATO, the UN, and OPEC set major foreign policy guidelines and define alliances. When powerful countries come together to compile their resources, they become even more powerful. A lot of these are regional based. For example, OPEC is the group of Middle Eastern countries that control the oil supply. And when these countries come together to better control their oil, it allows them to maximize like their self-interests. Non-governmental organizations, groups that focus on private people in many areas. These groups are disconnected from specific governments, which give them more autonomy over their foreign policy actions. A lot of these organizations are like humanitarian, like medical, charity type organizations. These organizations come together, for example, to help underdeveloped countries or to provide medical assistance for places that don't have, good medical care, things like that. Multinational corporations, businesses in multiple countries. Such businesses are incredibly powerful in influencing foreign relations. They want to insert their interests into all countries involved. So these businesses are active in multiple countries' governments, and they want to influence the government to get the best of their interests. They want each country to pass policies that support their business practices. Cold War, conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. Cold War fallout is still the basic background for foreign policy today. The conflict between capitalism and communism and the differences between Western and Eastern culture define foreign policy issues. That's why I think the Cold War is so fascinating, because even the policies set today on the foreign stage are based back from the Cold War. For example, like NATO is literally the organization that was created because of the fallout of World War II and the Cold War. When you examine who in the world are allies, who is at odds with each other, it all dates back to the Cold War. Crisis policy employed in emergency situations. This type of policy is often on quick notice. It can lead to the deployment of major military and medical forces. This is usually done in the case of a national emergency or a foreign emergency. Strategic policy, calculated plan towards specific issues. Major foreign policy initiatives are often targeted at a specific country, region, or problem. Strategic policies are employed when a country, for example the United States, has a specific interest towards a certain situation developing in another country. Structural defense policy focuses on defense and military spending. The amount of money allocated to the military is important. Military spending fluctuates depending on current events. One of the problems with our defense policy now is that recently we have been slightly cutting certain defense spending, certain spending on the military. Other countries are now spending a lot more on their military, and they have larger military forces than we have now. And that hit at a really bad time, especially with like the outbreak of the Ukraine and Russia and Israel, Palestine, things like that. National Security Council, this is just the NSC, advises the president. It notably consists of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, military chiefs, where the chairman advises the president on military matters. Unlike a lot of the old presidents now usually aren't like expert military officers, so they rely on the NSC and the Joint Chiefs, the military chiefs, to tell them what they should do when it comes to military policy, because the president is the head of the military, although they don't always have the best knowledge on what exactly to do, so they heavily rely on top military officers to advise them. Department of State manages foreign policy matters. It represents the U.S. in meetings with other countries as well as big treaty negotiations. Even though the president is like the symbol of U.S. foreign policy is conducted every day and the president can't always be there, so the Department of State handles matters on a day-to-day basis. Department of Defense manages military and its resources. This body controls where military money is spent and what operations are conducted. The Department of Defense, like the Pentagon, is just the massive head of how our military operates. It makes basically all the decisions. Intelligence community, agencies that handle information and data. This community is ever growing in the digital age. The CIA is incredibly powerful in gathering intelligence and conducting activities overseas and at home. With the growing use of computers and the internet by foreign governments, foreign agencies, and the growing amount of like cybercrime and crypto and encrypted networks, the intelligence community is really important. The intelligence community is really important in curbing the top level network of crime. Department of Homeland Security, protecting against foreign threats at home. It plays a major role in counterterrorism and protecting people from violence within the country. So Homeland Security forces are heavily employed when it comes to protecting people from potential terrorist attacks. Hegemon, dominance of one state over all other states. America as a hegemon is a key principle in the foreign policy sphere. America is the most dominant state force in the world and has the responsibility to act like it. It's just a fact that America is the most powerful. It's been this way since through the Cold War. America basically always burdens the responsibility when foreign problems arise. America seems to always involve itself in the foreign problems because they have the responsibility as the leader of the world to support other nations when it comes to crises. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This is the GATT agreement. I'm like being dead ass. It's actually GATT. It's not a joke. Encourages fair trade among more countries. It was influential both in its time, but also in starting off a new era that would open up trade. Honestly, this isn't that important. It's just like really funny because it's called GATT and like my entire class made jokes about this. Deterrence, preventing another actor from achieving an expected goal. This policy aims to control or resist foreign states from doing something against the interests of the country. So this strategy is done by countries that have a lot of influence, so like the United States, and they employ certain stuff to basically get other countries from not doing what they want to do. America basically has all the leverage in almost every negotiating situation. Compellence, influencing another nation or actor to do something. This can take place between allies or enemies. It intervenes in another country's affairs to try and make them do something. This idea of compellence, it comes up often when it comes to allies specifically, especially like in NATO, where the US has a lot of, bargaining power in NATO to get the smaller countries in NATO to kind of do what they want to do. Preemption, taking action on an enemy before it has a chance to do something. It functions more as prevention, as it stops growing forces from expanding any further or providing any greater of a threat. These actions can be done through diplomacy technically, but a lot of the time it's just done through force. If a country is gearing up to do something bad, the US can literally just bomb them or, put like a massive military threat on them, and essentially they can just control them that way. Propaganda, catering information to a foreign audience to influence thought, is a powerful and notable tool that aims to alter the culture and way of thinking of other people to change their views. This is done in times of war. Some of the most famous propaganda campaigns were ran by dictators like Hitler, Kim Jong-un, things like that. And it's really powerful in changing your entire people's way of thought and allows foreign policy actions to be taken without repercussions if your people agree with you. Diplomacy, formal and official foreign communication. It is the most legitimate and honorable way of conducting foreign policy. This is the most common way of foreign policy, although it is a little boring and not a lot of diplomatic actions like make the news. Covert operations, specific and secret undercover actions. Countries who conduct these operations escape the blame for actions as they are done in secret or covered up afterwards. And this can be good or bad. Countries can send in secret military operations to prevent bad countries from knowing that they're onto them. This can also be done by bad state actors, specifically in the way of inside jobs or things like they'll do crimes that tie back to a country but they're never found to be tied back to a specific country, things like that. A lot of terrorist threats have theories to be tied back to certain countries, but they're never really caught because they're covert operations. Foreign aid, monetarily assisting other countries. It is sent with a specific purpose, a lot of the time for military help or economic rebuilding. Foreign aid is massive in the aftermath of war, the aftermath of crises, or during war when they're trying to support or prop up a certain country. Aid always becomes a massive debate in the domestic political scene because a lot of people complain about how much money certain countries are spending, especially the United States, how much money we're spending on foreign aid when we should be spending it at home, things like that. Economic sanctions, punishments against other countries trying to sell goods. It serves as a way to influence bad foreign actors by striking at their economy. The US uses sanctions a lot. When countries are doing something bad, they'll try and stifle their economy by employing sanctions because we are a massive importer. We buy a lot of goods from foreign countries. We can shut off other countries' economies by basically saying we're not going to buy anything more from you. And NATO can do this, and those intergovernmental organizations can do this as a collective effort. So all the NATO countries can say that they're employing sanctions on a bad country. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next unit, and goodbye. Yo, if you're super cool and awesome, you should follow my Twitter or X if you're that kind of person. It's at Clark4724. I post a lot of random stuff on there, but I also post channel updates and when my next videos are coming out. So if you're gonna keep watching my channel, then I recommend you follow, and thanks.